All winter long, the snow didn't just fall from the sky, it was deliberately pushed onto my land. Day after day, plows redirected massive piles onto my property as if it were a dumping ground no one would question. My driveway vanished. My fence disappeared, and every complaint I filed was quietly ignored. The HOA called it standard procedure. I called it intentional. So instead of fighting them the way they expected, I let the snow stay. I let it grow, and by spring, it became something they never saw coming. What happens when quiet patience turns into an immovable wall? Before any snow was ever pushed onto my land, before the complaints and letters and quiet retaliation, life in the neighborhood felt almost boring in the best possible way. I had moved there for that reason. The community sat just far enough from the city to feel calm, but close enough that grocery runs and work commutes never felt like a chore. The houses followed a familiar pattern: clean lines, neutral colors, trimmed lawns that suggested pride more than obsession. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't cheap either. It was the kind of place people moved into believing they were buying peace. I was one of them. My home sat on a corner lot, bordered by a lightly traveled residential street on one side and a narrower HOA-maintained road on the other. The lot was slightly larger than most, with a gentle slope that dipped toward the street. That slope mattered later, though at the time, it just meant better drainage and a wider view from the windows. I had chosen the property deliberately, thinking ahead, imagining long winters, quiet mornings, and predictable routines. And for a while, that's exactly what I got. My days followed a comfortable rhythm. Work during the week, projects around the house on weekends, small improvements that made the place feel more like mine, reinforcing a fence, clearing brush near the edge of the lot, keeping the driveway wide and accessible. I wasn't trying to make a statement. I was trying to settle in. The neighbors were polite in the way people often are when they don't intend to get too close. Friendly waves, short conversations about weather and lawn care, complaints about rising costs and local taxes. Nobody overshared. Nobody pried. It felt like an unspoken agreement that everyone would respect each other's space. The HOA was there, of course. It always is. At first, it barely registered in my life. A welcome packet. A few emails about trash pickup schedules and seasonal reminders. Guidelines about fence height and paint colors. Nothing unusual. Nothing aggressive. The HOA felt more like background noise than authority. I read the rules, nodded along, and moved on. In those early months, winter hadn't yet arrived, and the roads were clear. The HOA-managed street bordering my property was narrow but functional, curving gently through the neighborhood. Snow removal was mentioned briefly in the documents, standard language about safety, access, and maintaining clear roadways. I didn't give it much thought. Like most people, I assumed it would be handled professionally and fairly. I had no reason to think otherwise. The first snowfall came quietly. It wasn't dramatic. Just a steady blanket overnight that turned lawns white and softened the edges of everything. The kind of snowfall that makes neighborhoods feel peaceful instead of threatening. I woke early, made coffee, and looked out the window to see the familiar calm of winter settling in. Later that morning, I heard the plow. The sound echoed faintly, mechanical and distant, moving down the HOA street. I didn't rush to the window. Snowplows were normal, necessary, expected. I went back to what I was doing, assuming the road would be cleared and that would be the end of it. It wasn't until later that afternoon that I noticed something odd. Along the edge of my property, near the HOA road, a line of snow had been piled higher than the rest. It wasn't enormous. Not yet. But it was noticeably different from what had been left on other lots. While most homes had a thin ridge near their curb, mine had a thicker mound that crept several feet inward. I shrugged it off. Snow had to go somewhere, I told myself. Corner lot. Awkward angle. Probably just how the plow passed through. There was no malice in it. No intention. At least, that's what I believed. The second snowfall came heavier. This time, the plow ran earlier in the morning. I watched from inside as it moved down the street, blade angled, snow spraying off to one side. And again, when it passed my property, the sound changed slightly. The spray lingered longer. The pile grew taller. By noon, the snowbank along my property line was impossible to ignore. It blocked part of my side access. It pressed against the fence. It wasn't just leftover snow. It looked intentional, concentrated, as if my land had become the designated dumping zone. Still, I resisted the urge to assume the worst. I cleared what I could, shoveled paths, cut into the bank to free the fence line. It was inconvenient, but manageable. Winter always brings extra work. That was part of the deal. The third snowfall changed how it felt. The accumulation came faster than I could clear it. Each pass of the plow added another layer to the same spot. While neighboring properties had modest piles that melted and shrank between storms, mine didn't. It grew denser, taller, more compacted. Snow hardened into ice. Ice fused into a wall-like mass that refused to budge. I sent my first message to the HOA, then .it wasn't angry. It wasn't accusatory. It was careful and polite. I explained what I was seeing and asked whether snow could be distributed more evenly to avoid blocking access and damaging my fence. The response came days later. Short, vague, neutral. They thanked me for bringing it to their attention and assured me that snow removal followed standard procedures designed to keep roads safe. Nothing changed. By the time December settled in fully, the snowbank had become a permanent feature of my property. It cast shadows where sunlight used to fall. It narrowed usable space. It trapped ice against the fence posts, bending them slightly inward. I cleared it again and again. Each time, the next snowfall erased my effort in minutes. It began to feel less like inconvenience and more like a pattern. I watched how the plow moved, how it angled its blade before reaching my lot, how it corrected itself immediately after passing. The contrast became impossible to ignore. Snow wasn't being pushed randomly. It was being guided. Still, I hesitated to escalate. HOAs have a reputation. Once you're labeled difficult, everything becomes harder. Complaints are scrutinized. Requests are delayed. Every rule becomes sharper. I didn't want that. I wanted to live quietly and be left alone. So I adapted. I reinforced the fence. I carved channels into the snow to redirect meltwater. I adjusted where I parked. I documented what I could, taking photos after each storm, telling myself it was just precaution. Winter deepened. The snowbank grew so large that it began to alter how the street looked. From certain angles, it appeared as if my property had risen higher than the road itself. Drivers slowed slightly when passing. Some glanced over, curious. No one said anything. The HOA didn't reach out. No explanation. No acknowledgement. Just silence. And silence has a way of changing how things feel. What once seemed like coincidence began to feel deliberate. What once felt manageable started to feel personal. I wasn't asking for special treatment. I was asking not to be treated as expendable. Each snowfall added weight. Not just physical, but emotional. A sense that my space, my effort, my investment didn't matter. That convenience for the HOA outweighed fairness for a single homeowner. By midwinter, the snowbank was taller than the fence. It pressed inward like a boundary being tested. It blocked visibility at the corner. It trapped debris and ice. It turned a portion of my land into something unusable and unsafe. That's when I realized the conflict wasn't coming. It had already begun, and whether the HOA intended it or not, they had chosen my property as the place where all their winter problems would disappear. The only question left was how long I was supposed to accept it, and what would happen when I finally stopped clearing the snow and let it stay exactly where they kept putting it.by the heart of winter. The snow on my property stopped feeling temporary and started feeling permanent. What had once been a nuisance became an obstacle that shaped my daily life. The snowbank was no longer just along the edge of the lot. It was a hardened mass, layered and compacted by weeks of plow passes and freezing nights. Each storm added another dense sheet, pressing inward, creeping closer to the house, narrowing the usable space I'd paid for. And still, it all came from the same place. Every snowfall followed the same pattern. The HOA-managed street was cleared first, aggressively and efficiently. The blade angled just enough to push everything outward, and that outward direction happened to be my property. Other homes received a thin, manageable ridge. Mine received the full force of the displacement. It was no longer subtle. It was consistent. I kept documenting. Photos after each storm. Measurements of height and width. Notes on dates, temperatures, and how long it took for the plow to pass. I told myself it was preparation, not paranoia. If I ever needed proof, I wanted it airtight. When I sent a second message to the HOA, the tone shifted. This time I included photos. Clear comparisons. Neighboring lots. My lot. The difference was obvious. I asked, again calmly, whether snow could be redistributed or at least not concentrated in one place that blocked access and damaged private property. The reply came faster, still polite, still vague, but colder. They explained that snow removal routes were fixed, that safety and efficiency were the priority. That snow was considered a temporary condition and not a violation of property boundaries during winter operations. In other words, it was my problem. I pushed back gently, pointing out that temporary no longer applied when the accumulation never left, when it compacted into ice, when it damaged fencing and reduced visibility at the corner, creating a safety concern. That message went unanswered. A week later, I received my first notice. It wasn't about the snow. It was about my fence. According to the HOA, the fence bordering the HOA street was misaligned and leaning outward, creating an aesthetic issue. I was instructed to correct it within a specified time frame or face a fine. I stood in the snow and stared at that fence for a long time. The fence hadn't moved before winter. It had been straight and secure. Now it bowed slightly inward in some places, outward in others, warped by the constant pressure of ice packed against it. Pressure caused by snow the HOA had pushed there repeatedly. They caused the damage, and they were fining me for it. I cleared snow from the base of the fence again, digging until my hands burned and my shoulders ached. I reinforced posts where I could, despite the frozen ground resisting every attempt. I sent another message explaining the situation, attaching photos that showed the snowbank pressing directly against the fence line. The response was brief. The HOA did not acknowledge responsibility. The fine remained. That's when the frustration turned into something heavier. Every action I took to protect my property was being met with silence or punishment. The rules, which once felt like background noise, now felt weaponized. I wasn't being treated like a homeowner. I was being managed, and winter wasn't slowing down. Each new storm made the snowbank taller and denser. The plow didn't adjust. It didn't hesitate. It didn't redistribute. It followed its route and unloaded everything onto my land with mechanical consistency. Neighbors began to notice. Cars slowed more noticeably at the corner. Some drivers edged wider, cautious of visibility blocked by the snow mass. A few neighbors walked past and glanced over longer than usual. No one asked questions, but their curiosity was obvious. Still, no one intervened. I received another notice shortly after. This one cited snow accumulation encroaching on HOA-managed visibility zones. I read it twice. The HOA was warning me that snow on my property, snow they had pushed there, was now a violation because it interfered with sight lines at the intersection. They instructed me to remove it. The absurdity was staggering. I was being told to fix a problem they created under threat of additional fines, using methods that were physically unrealistic. The snowbank was no longer loose powder. It was layered ice, compressed by vehicle weight and time. Removing it entirely would require heavy equipment. Equipment I wasn't allowed to bring onto the HOA street without approval. Approval they hadn't granted. I sent another message, this time firmer, outlining the contradictions. I explained that the snow accumulation was the direct result of their plowing practices, that I had attempted reasonable mitigation, and that full removal was impractical without changes on their end. The reply was the shortest yet. They reiterated that homeowners were responsible for conditions on their property. That was it. No acknowledgement. No compromise. No solution. Just responsibility. By late January, the fines began stacking. First for the fence, then for visibility, then for failure to maintain property appearance. Each notice arrived with clean formatting and legal language, stripped of context, as if the snowbank had appeared out of nowhere on its own. I paid the first fine, not because I agreed, but because I knew how HOAs worked. Unpaid. Fines became liens. Liens became leverage. I wasn't willing to give them that. But something changed when I clicked submit. Paying didn't bring relief. It brought clarity. The system wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as designed. Efficient, impersonal, relentless. And I was done expecting fairness from it. Instead of clearing the snow completely, I changed tactics. I stopped cutting it down. I focused only on keeping my driveway usable and my front access clear. I carved paths where I needed them and left the rest untouched. If the HOA wanted the snow gone, they could stop putting it there. They didn't. Storm after storm, the pile grew. It reached heights I'd never seen on residential property. The base widened. The edges hardened into vertical faces of ice that barely melted even on warmer days. The snowbank began to look less like a pile and more like a structure. I noticed something else too. As the snow grew, it started to affect the HOA street itself. The narrowed visibility made drivers slow more. Some avoided the street altogether during peak hours. The once smooth curve of the road now felt constricted, hemmed in by a white wall that loomed higher each week. The HOA noticed. Another notice arrived, warning that continued accumulation could result in corrective action. They didn't explain what that meant. They didn't need to. Corrective action could involve contractors. Charges. Emergency measures billed directly to me. The ambiguity was intentional. Fear was part of the process. But fear had lost its edge. I reread the HOA bylaws late one night, going line by line. Snow removal policies, property boundaries, responsibility clauses. I wasn't looking for loopholes. I was looking for certainty. And I found something interesting. The HOA was responsible for maintaining clear and safe roadways. Homeowners were responsible for their property, but only for conditions they caused or allowed. There was no clause granting the HOA permission to permanently store snow on private land. No provision stating that displaced snow became the homeowner's liability once dumped. It was a gray area, and gray areas are dangerous for people who assume compliance. I stopped messaging the HOA. I stopped explaining. I stopped apologizing. I let the snow stay exactly where it was pushed. By February, the snowbank had transformed into a solid, towering mass that ran the length of my property along the HOA street. It blocked sightlines entirely from certain angles. It altered traffic patterns. It forced drivers to slow, adjust, and react. And still, the plow kept coming. Each pass added to it, reinforcing the structure layer by layer, like a wall being deliberately fortified. The irony was impossible to ignore. The HOA was unknowingly constructing the very thing they would later claim violated their rules. Neighbors began talking. Not to me directly, but around me. I noticed the looks, the subtle gestures toward the snow, the way conversations paused when I approached. The situation had become visible, undeniable. The HOA could no longer pretend it wasn't happening. The next notice was different that IT referenced potential obstruction of community infrastructure and warned of immediate intervention if conditions worsened. No fine attached. No deadline. Just a threat. Winter wasn't over. The snowbank wasn't shrinking. And the HOA had finally realized that the problem they'd pushed onto my property was now pressing back against them. What they didn't realize yet was that every inch of that frozen wall existed because of their choices, and removing it wouldn't be as simple as sending another notice. The confrontation didn't begin with shouting or flashing lights. It began with engines. I heard them early in the morning, long before the sun fully cleared the rooftops. Heavy diesel engines idling on the HOA-managed street, deeper and louder than the usual plow. I looked out from the window and immediately understood what was happening. This wasn't routine maintenance. This was intervention. Two large trucks sat nose to tail near the corner of my property. One carried a front loader. The other hauled industrial snow removal equipment meant for parking lots and commercial roads. Behind them, an HOA utility vehicle was parked at an angle, hazard lights blinking steadily, as if to announce authority. They had finally decided to act. I didn't rush outside. I watched. The operators stepped out first, bundled in reflective jackets, looking uncertain. They studied the snowbank the way people study a problem they didn't expect to be so big. From the street, the mass looked even larger than it did from my yard. Weeks of compacted snow and ice had fused into a single structure, tall, dense, and unforgiving. Behind them stood two HOA board members and the property manager. I recognized them immediately. They didn't look at my house at first. They looked at the wall. From their perspective, it was impossible to miss what they had created. The snowbank rose along the entire length of my property like a frozen barricade, towering over the street, narrowing it, dominating the corner. It wasn't just unsightly. It was undeniable, and it existed because of them. The property manager spoke first, gesturing sharply toward the equipment. The loader operator shook his head. Even from a distance, I could tell the message wasn't what the HOA wanted to hear. The machine wasn't designed to remove something like this cleanly. Not without space. Not without risking damage. They turned their attention toward my property. That was my cue. I stepped outside, boots crunching against the packed snow, and walked slowly toward the edge of the lot. I didn't carry anything. No paperwork. No phone. No visible preocupación. I wanted the moment to be exactly what it was. Unavoidable. The property manager approached, already speaking before reaching me, voice tight and formal. I didn't interrupt. I let the words spill out, complaints about safety, visibility, emergency access. Accusations that I had allowed the snow to accumulate to this extent. Statements that immediate removal was necessary and that costs would be billed accordingly. I waited until they finished. Then I told them no. Not angrily. Not loudly. Just clearly. No, they did not have permission to enter my property. No, they could not remove the snowbank without addressing how it got there. No, I would not accept responsibility for something I didn't create. The reaction was immediate. The board members bristled. The property manager's tone sharpened. They cited bylaws, emergency powers, community safety. They warned me, again, about fines, about legal action, about consequences. I listened, unmoved. Then I did something they didn't expect. I walked along the snowbank and pointed. I pointed to the layers. Distinct, visible strata, each one marking a separate storm. Each one compacted and angled in the exact direction of the plow blade. Each one proof that this wasn't natural accumulation. It was systematic dumping. I pointed to the fence damage, to the warp posts, to the crushed sections near the base. I pointed to the corner where visibility had been fine before winter and only became obstructed after weeks of concentrated dumping. And then I told them what I had done. I told them I had documented every snowfall, every plow pass, every notice, every fine. I told them I had photographs showing comparative accumulation across the neighborhood. I told them I had the HOA's own emails acknowledging their plowing routes. Started to melt, not all at once, but slowly, releasing weeks of pressure and ice back into the ground. As it receded, the street opened up again. Visibility returned. Normalcy crept back in. But the impact didn't disappear with the snow, because the HOA had learned something they never expected to learn. And in the resolution that followed, the consequences would reach far beyond my property line, changing how power was exercised in the neighborhood forever. When the snow finally began to retreat, it did so slowly, reluctantly, as if even winter understood that what had been built here was more than weather. Day by day, the frozen walls softened. Edges collapsed inward. The sharp, vertical faces rounded off, dripping steadily as sunlight reclaimed ground that had been buried for months. Meltwater traced paths through channels I had carved long ago, carrying away the last physical evidence of the HOA's quiet aggression. But while the snow disappeared, the consequences didn't. The first change came in silence. For weeks after the confrontation, there were no notices, no emails, no reminders. The steady hum of enforcement that had once followed me like a shadow simply stopped. My mailbox stayed empty. My online account showed a balance of 0. Even the automated system that once flagged minor issues went quiet. The HOA had retreated. Not publicly, not loudly, but unmistakably. Spring arrived with a clarity that winter never allowed. As the ground thawed, the damage became visible in ways snow had hidden. Bent fence posts had to be reset. Sections of lawn needed reseeding. The soil along the property line was compacted unevenly, scarred by months of pressure. I documented it all, calmly, methodically. This time, I didn't have to send anything. The HOA reached out first. The message was carefully worded, stripped of emotion, heavy with formality. It referenced community review, operational adjustments, and preventative measures going forward. And denying responsibility. And then I told them the part that made everything go quiet. I told them I had consulted an attorney. Not a threat, a fact. I explained that the HOA's actions likely constituted unauthorized use of private property, damage to homeowner infrastructure, and retaliatory enforcement of bylaws. I explained that any attempt to remove the snow without consent would be treated as trespass, that billing me for corrective action would be contested, that escalation would not go the way they expected. The property manager's expression changed first. Not anger. Calculation. The board members exchanged glances, suddenly aware that this wasn't a compliant homeowner they were dealing with. This was someone who had stopped absorbing pressure and started redirecting it. They argued again, but the energy was different now. Less confident, more defensive. They talked about emergencies, about liability, about the community. I responded with one simple truth. The snowbank existed because the HOA put it there. And until they acknowledged that, it wasn't going anywhere. That's when the loader operator spoke again. He explained, carefully, that removing the snow would require pushing it somewhere else. That there was no room on the HOA street. That the only available space was my property, or hauling it away entirely, which would be costly. Very costly. The board members froze. Cost had always been their weapon. Now it was a liability. They stepped aside to confer, voices low but tense. The property manager paced. The blinking hazard lights reflected off the ice wall, turning it into something almost theatrical. A spotlighted monument to mismanagement. Neighbors began to gather, not in a crowd, but in small clusters. People stood at the edges of driveways, watching. Phones came out. Conversations paused. The moment was no longer private. This wasn't just my dispute anymore. It was a spectacle. The HOA returned with a new approach. They proposed a compromise. They would remove part of the snow. They would share responsibility. They would reassess plowing routes going forward. I asked them a simple question. Who pays for the damage? Silence. Who covers the fines already issued? More silence. Who acknowledges, in writing, that the dumping was improper? The property manager looked away. That was the answer. I refused again. The board members grew visibly frustrated. Authority was slipping through their fingers, and everyone could see it. The wall stood behind me, solid and unmoving, a physical manifestation of every ignored message and dismissed complaint. They threatened legal action. I told them to proceed. They threatened emergency enforcement. I reminded them of trespass laws. They threatened community consequences. I reminded them that communities were built on fairness, not intimidation. The loader engines were shut off. One by one, the contractors climbed back into their vehicles, clearly relieved to be exiting a situation that had turned volatile. The HOA utility vehicle followed. Hazard lights went dark. The street fell quiet. The snowbank remained. For the rest of the winter, nothing changed. The plow still came, but now it adjusted its blade before reaching my property. Snow was distributed differently, more evenly, less aggressively. The wall stopped growing, but didn't shrink. It stood there, towering, visible, undeniable, a frozen reminder of what happens when power is abused too casually. Then, near the end of the season, something unexpected happened. I received a letter, not a notice, not a fine, a letter. It acknowledged procedural errors in snow management. It rescinded the fence violation. It credited back the fines I'd paid. It stated that future snow removal would be conducted with greater care regarding private property boundaries. It didn't apologize. It didn't admit fault, but it conceded. And as temperatures finally began to rise, the wall confirmed what the letter had already implied. Snow removal procedures had been revised. Plow routes were updated. Operators were instructed to distribute accumulation evenly and avoid depositing snow on private property wherever possible. No admission of wrongdoing, but a complete change in behavior. Repairs to the fence were approved without resistance. The HOA framed it as goodwill maintenance, a phrase that carried more meaning than they likely intended. The funds were released quickly, without debate. Contractors arrived and worked efficiently, reinforcing what had been damaged and leaving the property stronger than it had been before winter. The corner lot no longer felt like a vulnerability. It felt like proof. Neighbors began approaching me as spring settled in fully, not in confrontations or formal complaints, but casually, while walking dogs, while collecting mail, while standing near driveways during quiet afternoons. They didn't ask detailed questions. They didn't need explanations. They already knew. They had watched the wall grow. They had seen the equipment arrive and leave. They had noticed the sudden shift in how the HOA behaved afterward. In communities governed by quiet power, observation spreads faster than rumor. Some shared their own stories, fines that appeared without warning, requests denied without explanation, rules enforced selectively, depending on who challenged them and who didn't. Stories of compliance born not from agreement, but exhaustion. What surprised me wasn't the frustration in their voices. It was the relief. The snow wall had done something unexpected. It had given shape to something invisible. It had made power tangible. And once people saw it, they couldn't unsee it. The HOA board changed that year. Not dramatically, not in a sweep, but noticeably. Two long-standing members didn't seek re-election. New names appeared on ballots. People who had never attended meetings before suddenly did. Questions were asked. Policies were examined more closely. The tone shifted. Where enforcement had once been rigid and unquestioned, it became procedural. Where ambiguity had once been used as leverage, it now had to be clarified. The HOA didn't become perfect. No organization does. But became careful. Careful was new. The revised snow removal policy was distributed before the next winter. It was explicit. Clear boundaries were defined. Responsibility was assigned in writing. There was no room for interpretation that allowed snow to temporarily become someone else's burden. The irony wasn't lost on me. What months of polite emails had failed to accomplish, a wall of ice had achieved effortlessly. The following winter arrived quietly. Snow fell again, as it always does. The plow came down the street. The blade adjusted well before reaching my property. Snow was spread thinly, evenly, never allowed to pile high against a single lot. I didn't shovel defensively anymore. I didn't document obsessively. I didn't brace for conflict. The system, once forced to confront itself, had corrected course. But the most meaningful change wasn't procedural. It was internal. For months, I had felt like I was reacting, responding to notices, mitigating damage, absorbing pressure. The conflict had consumed time and energy in ways that were difficult to quantify. Even when I stopped clearing the snow, I was still responding to the HOA's actions. After the resolution, that stopped. The sense of vigilance faded. The constant awareness of rules and consequences loosened its grip. I stopped anticipating enforcement and started reclaiming normalcy. The property felt like mine again, not a contested boundary. And with that came clarity. The conflict had never really been about snow. It had been about assumption. The HOA assumed compliance because compliance was easier. They assumed inconvenience would be absorbed quietly. They assumed rules didn't need to be fair if they were enforced. Consistently enough, they assumed that private frustration would never harden into public consequence. They were wrong. The wall had exposed a truth that applied far beyond one neighborhood. Systems that rely on silence eventually collide with someone who refuses to provide it. And when that happens, the system has only two choices: adapt or fracture. The HOA adapted because fracture would have been visible, costly, and irreversible. Other homeowners benefited from that adaptation, even if they never knew exactly why it happened. That was enough for me. I didn't pursue legal action after the letter. I didn't escalate further. I didn't demand public acknowledgement. The outcome was already complete. Pressing for more would have been about victory, not resolution. And resolution had been achieved. The fence stood straight again. The corner was clear. The street flowed normally. The balance of power had shifted quietly back toward fairness. What remained was understanding. Power, when unchecked, tends to grow lazy. It stops justifying itself. It stops explaining. It starts acting as if inconvenience is proof of authority. But inconvenience cuts both ways. The snow wall was never planned. It wasn't designed as a protest or a statement. It was the natural consequence of repeated disregard, allowed to accumulate until it could no longer be ignored. That's what made it effective. It didn't shout. It didn't threaten. It simply existed, visible and undeniable, reflecting the HOA's own actions back at them in physical form. The lesson wasn't about revenge. It was about boundaries. About knowing when to stop absorbing pressure and start redirecting it. About understanding that patience isn't weakness, but it isn't infinite either. About recognizing that systems change not when they're asked politely, but when their assumptions are challenged by reality. For anyone watching this who lives under an HOA or any authority structure that governs daily life quietly, the takeaway is simple but uncomfortable. Read what you agree to. Document what affects you. And don't assume silence is the only option. You don't have to escalate immediately. You don't have to confront loudly. Sometimes the most effective response is restraint combined with clarity, allowing consequences to reveal themselves without interference. Because when power overreaches, it often builds its own undoing layer by layer, just waiting for someone willing to stop clearing it away. The snow melted. The wall disappeared. But the understanding it created stayed. And the next time winter comes, everyone in that neighborhood will remember exactly how high things can pile up when fairness is ignored, and how difficult it is to dismantle a problem once it's been allowed to solidify.